Alright, here we are, the final episode, fellas. If you have made it this far, maybe you will stick around a bit longer. I promise it won't be too bad. And yeah, I know, it's another episode full of doom and gloom, because why not? That's what we do here. But hey, let's at least try to make it a bit easier to get through. So to lighten the mood, and as a little reward for my loyal viewers, I'm gonna kick things off with something really special. Jingwu's signature dish, rice cooker hot pot. Rest assured, the man did not forget his rice cooker. He never goes anywhere without it. And today, we're making the most of it. Drumsticks. Let's get some water in here. Some sweet Yurtish river water. Tomato, I only have one left. And green onions. Voila. Voila. I'm such a genius. Cheers. Let's go. Soup base. I need more people in the party. One more. Can see you in a bit. Look at that. Oh my god. Chicken. Green onions. Tomato. My life is too good. Oh, by the way, this was in Simi, Kazakhstan. We've been to dozens of cities in this series, but the one city that keeps showing up is Simi. We've talked about everything from its Tunga past, the flooding Irtysh River, Dostoevsky's little stop here, and of course, that weird local guy who could predict the future. But now, it's time for one last tour of Simi. Let's head over to the Irtysh and set the clock to 1949. Because it was in 1949 that this region was chosen by the Soviet atomic bomb program to be the site of nuclear testing. The Semiplentisk test site, aka the polygon. Like every other river, there are several river islands in the Irtysh, and that one over there is perhaps the most beautiful river island I've ever seen. There's a place to do sports, a park, a zoo, and most importantly, you can find this. The Stronger Than Death Memorial, erected in 2001 for the victims of the nuclear tests. What we're looking at is a 30-meter tall black tombstone featuring a mom with her baby at the very bottom and a polygon mushroom at the top. The command center is about 140 kilometers that way in a city called Kurchatov, named after the father of the Soviet atomic bomb, Igor Kurchatov. On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union successfully detonated its first nuclear bomb there. Immediately after the war, Stalin returned to his old ways and launched a third purge. Thousands of cadres were dismissed, accused of corruption, nationalism, or careerism. The grip of central power tightened, and fear returned. But even Stalin had to die at some point, which he did on March 5, 1953. The next leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, faced a number of daunting problems: low standards of living, poor agricultural productivity, and the need to compete with a vastly richer United States. It was clear that Stalin's methods of rule based on terror and violence could not continue in his absence. Khrushchev promptly denounced Stalin for his crimes against the party. He removed many Stalin appointees, rehabilitated the victims of the purges, and shut down the gulags. Khrushchev spearheaded the Virgin Lands campaign in 1954 to boost food production, bringing vast pasture lands in Kazakhstan and Siberia under the plow. From the late 1950s on, he pushed for the expansion of urban housing to improve living conditions. Across the Soviet Union, identical 5- or 9-story buildings transformed the urban landscape. Several irrigation projects broke ground: the Karakum Canal in Turkmenistan, the Hungary Steppe Project in Uzbekistan, the Amur-Bukhara Canal, and the Nulik Dam in Tajikistan. The race with the US intensified. Roughly a decade after Central Asia entered the nuclear age, it also stepped into the space age. On October 4, 1957, in Baikonur, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite into orbit. Just 3.5 years later, on April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to journey into space. Having consolidated his position, Khrushchev turned on his allies and pursued a policy of centralization. Between 1959 and 1962, he forced the removal of the leaders of all 5 Central Asian republics. Having survived the upheavals of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, party members wanted stability more than anything, but Khrushchev offered none. In the end, a coup was staged, and in October 1964, the 70-year-old Khrushchev was forced to resign. The new leadership under Brezhnev began a period of rule that lasted into the mid-1980s, and trust in cadres became the new slogan. Brezhnev kept most of the Khrushchev-era leaders in power. The only change he made was to bring his old friend Kunayev back into office in Kazakhstan. As a result of Brezhnev's policy, 4 of the 5 republics were run by the same man throughout the period, and 3 of them died in office. The one exception was the first secretary of Turkmenistan, who was ousted by his own cadres in 1969. His successor stayed in power for the rest of the Brezhnev period. The years under Brezhnev were Central Asia's golden age. The economy grew, standards of living rose, and people came to identify with the Soviet state as never before. Men were subject to compulsory military service but benefited from free education and almost free healthcare. Roads, schools, and other infrastructure reached even the smallest villages. In addition, government support for jobs, pensions, and maternity leave expanded substantially. Poverty fell, the population grew, and the share of Central Asians in the Union nearly doubled over this period, from 6.3% in 1959 to 12.3% in 1989. Islam was secularized. Dietary taboos largely disappeared. Alcohol was a casual feature of life across society, and even the consumption of pork became common. For most Muslims in the Soviet Union, Islam became more a marker of national identity than of religious practice. Very few people performed everyday rituals. Tashkent, the center of Russian power in Central Asia, underwent major transformation after a devastating earthquake in 1966. Its reconstruction became a union-wide effort. Over the next 3 years, a model Soviet city was built with wide boulevards, extensive parks, green spaces, and massive apartment blocks. In 1977, to mark the 60th anniversary of the October Revolution, a lavishly decorated metro opened. For many newly independent countries, Sovietness symbolized modernity, socialism, and a commitment to justice and equality. The Central Asian experience showed them that socialism could be achieved bypassing capitalism. Yet, nothing good comes without a price, and the golden age calls for a golden prize. By the 1980s, Brezhnev-era prosperity was fading. Economic growth slowed, industrial investment declined, agriculture suffered, and rapid population growth strained resources. Moscow's relentless demand for cotton led to environmental and social collapse. Cotton took up 46% of farmland in the 3 southern republics. and crop rotation was largely abandoned to keep up with the ever-increasing demand for cotton. Per capita consumption of meat, eggs, and milk remained well below the Soviet average, while infant mortality rate was nearly twice as high. Heavy use of chemicals began in the 1950s and reached 20 to 25 kilograms per hectare by the 1980s. The land itself became toxic. The biggest ecological catastrophe, however, was the slow death of the Alar Sea, once the fourth largest lake on Earth. I am now in southern Tajikistan, and that, my friends, is the Amudarya, the other lifeline of Central Asia. And I've always enjoyed standing by the river. You can feel the energy of the river coursing through you, and it brings me so much joy. Anyway, while I'm here feeling all this energy, I'd like to discuss a man-made disaster, the dying of the Alar Sea. And when we talk about the dying of the Alar Sea, we cannot avoid the topic of cotton, the white gold of Central Asia, and the #1 killer of the Alar Sea. In the 1960s, the Soviet Union aimed to boost the cotton production in Central Asia, and this thirsty crop demanded a lot of water. To satisfy the water needs of cotton, the Soviets redirected substantial water from the City Darya and Amudarya, the feeders of the Alar Sea. Up to 60 cubic kilometers of water was redirected every year. With less water flowing in, the Alar Sea started shrinking rapidly. The seafloor became exposed and the remaining water became saltier. The consequences were devastating. Fisheries collapsed as the water became too salty for fish. The exposed seabed, laced with agricultural chemicals, turned into dust storms, harming human health. The dying of the Alar Sea highlights the importance of sustainable water management and the potential consequences of prioritizing short-term economic gains over long-term environmental health. I mean, what could we possibly gain without nature? Meanwhile, Kazakhstan faced another dire problem. After the first atomic bomb was successfully detonated, Pandora's box was opened. The Soviet Union started manufacturing and testing nuclear weapons on a large scale. In total, the Soviet Union conducted 750 nuclear weapon tests throughout the Cold War, and among them, 456 nuclear tests took place in the Polygon from 1949 to 1989, including 340 underground tests and 116 atmospheric tests. That is about 11.4 nuclear bombs every year for 40 years, making Polygon the most nuked territory on Earth. If not for the protest in 1989, the testing might continue to the fall of the Soviet Union. And as you can imagine, after so many nukes, bombs, for so many years, the land and the people near the Polygon suffered greatly. The nuclear fallout from the atmospheric tests and the uncontrolled exposure of the workers has resulted in high rates of cancer, childhood leukemia, and birth defects among the residents of neighboring villages. It is estimated that about 1.5 million people have been exposed to the fallout over the years, and the cleaning of the nuclear waste took 17 years and was completed just 12 years ago in 2012. I was actually planning to visit the command center in Kurchatov, but when I went to the bus station yesterday, I was told that there was no bus going there anymore. And truth be told, that is not the kind of risk I want to take. And I'm a little concerned about the radiation there affecting my house. Besides, there are already a lot of wonderful documentaries you can find online about Kurchatov made by people with bigger balls than mine. So I figured, why take the unnecessary risk of damaging my balls and my future kids for something that I probably couldn't do as well as them? You know, we humans are capable of incredible compassion, love, and altruism. We build communities, create art, and work to improve the lives of others. Yet, we also wage war, destroy environments, and inflict immense suffering. And this duality is especially heartbreaking because it shows us the potential for good that we sometimes squander. On September 8, 2006, here in Semipalatinsk, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan signed the Central Asian Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone. But does that mean history will never repeat itself? I doubt it. And finally, in 2007, the City Council voted unanimously in favor of changing the name Semipalatinsk to Simi, saying goodbye to its nuclear past.
As for the two stands in South Asia, there was not a day of peace. Just 2 months after the 1947 partition of India, the First Indo-Pakistani War broke out over Kashmir. Now, for those of you who are less familiar with the situation, you might be wondering, wait a second, didn't the British draw the borders between the two countries? So why are they still fighting over them? Well, that's because the British did not draw a line through Kashmir. You see, when the Raj was partitioned in 1947, the hundreds of princely states were not directly divided. Instead, they were given a choice: join India, join Pakistan, or at least in theory, remain independent. For most princely states, fully surrounded by one country or the other, their integration was only a matter of time. But Kashmir was different. It was large, wealthy, and uniquely positioned, both geographically and religiously. It sat between India and Pakistan. Its population was mostly Muslim, but its rulers were Hindu. Both India and Pakistan wanted Kashmir on their side. The Hindu ruler, however, hoped to remain independent. He knew that the Muslims wouldn't want to join India, and that Hindus and Sikhs wouldn't want to join Pakistan. But as partition progressed, it became increasingly likely that Kashmir might accede to India. Alarmed, Pakistan backed tribal Pashtun forces to invade Kashmir in October 1947. The ruler panicked and turned to India for help. India was like, relax, we will help, but only if you accede to us first. Kashmir was not in a position to negotiate and signed the Instrument of Accession. After Indian troops entered the war, the fronts solidified gradually along what came to be known as the Line of Control. A ceasefire was declared in 1949. India gained control of about 2/3 of Kashmir, whereas Pakistan held roughly 1/3. In the 1960s, Pakistan received $700 million in military aid from the United States, significantly modernizing its armed forces.
It is a great pleasure and great honor for me to welcome our distinguished visitor, the President of Pakistan. We are glad to have you here because you come as the head of an important and powerful country, which is allied with us in CETO, which is associated with us in CENTO, which represents a powerful force for freedom in your area of the world.
In contrast, India had recently been defeated by China in 1962 and was still in the process of restructuring its military. In 1965, believing India to be too weak to retaliate, Pakistan sent troops to capture the rest of Kashmir. India, however, not only responded forcefully, but also launched a counterattack on West Pakistan. A ceasefire was declared only after intervention by the Soviet Union and the United States. In 1971, a third war broke out between India and Pakistan, leading to the secession of East Pakistan. Since partition, East Pakistan had been politically and economically dominated by West Pakistan. The two regions, separated by 1,600 kilometers and lying on the opposite sides of the Himalayas, were home to different ethnic groups, languages, and histories. The only thing they had in common was their faith in Islam. In 1970, East Pakistanis voted for a political party that advocated autonomy for the East.
Naturally, these 23 years you have seen that East Pakistan, particularly the Bengal, is nothing but a colonial market. If you want to save that and give equal right as a Pakistani, then you have to give Bengal their right to live. And they must be master of their own resources because they have been exploited for long 23 years. It cannot be tolerated anymore.
But the West Pakistani government refused to recognize the results.
I do not believe that people of East Pakistan want to separate from West Pakistan. They are the majority people of Pakistan. How should a majority separate from a minority? If you hear these notes, if you hear these rumblings, let me assure you, this is not the real voice of my people.
In response, East Pakistan protested, declared independence, and was brutally suppressed by West Pakistan. About 10 million East Pakistanis fled to India, which supported the guerrilla fighters and eventually sent its own military forces. Within 2 weeks of intense fighting, Pakistan was defeated on both fronts and forced to accept the creation of an independent Bangladesh. With the loss of East Pakistan, the country also lost half its navy, a quarter of its air force, and a third of its army. It's worth noting, however, Pakistan was not entirely alone in the Third Indo-Pakistani War. It had one ally, sort of, the United States. At the time, the US was mired in Vietnam and wasn't sure about how to respond to the crisis. To Washington, Pakistan was a valuable partner, having facilitated a rapprochement with China in the early 1970s. The Americans didn't want a Soviet-backed India to become too powerful and feared that Pakistan would be greatly weakened if its eastern province seceded. However, the widespread condemnation of atrocities in East Pakistan limited how much support the US was willing to offer the Pakistani government. In the end, the US acted ambiguously. The USS Enterprise carrier group left Vietnam, moved toward the Bay of Bengal, made a brief stop in Singapore, and then arrived in Sri Lanka. This maneuver signaled to the Soviet Union and China that American intervention was possible, but by not ordering direct intervention, the US also made it clear to both India and Pakistan that its commitment to involvement in South Asia had limits. This ambiguity damaged American prestige in both countries. Pakistan felt betrayed by Washington's failure to prevent the loss of East Pakistan, while India resented US support for a regime responsible for brutal repression in what would become Bangladesh. Meanwhile, the Soviet-India alliance grew stronger, as did the China-Pakistan alliance. Yet, America's biggest diplomatic failure in the region was not in Pakistan, India, or Bangladesh, but in Afghanistan. In May 1946, Hashim Khan resigned the premiership due to poor health. His brother Shah Mahmud Khan succeeded him. During his tenure, the United States began expanding its influence into South Asia to counter the Soviet Union. American companies arrived and helped build dams and canals to increase arable land in southwest Afghanistan. However, the irrigation scheme didn't work out, and Afghanistan soon faced an economic crisis. Shah Mahmud Khan resigned in 1953 and was succeeded by his nephew, Dawood. Dawood was a different kind of ruler from his uncles. The elder Mujahideen leaders had avoided conflict with tribal forces and built their legitimacy through personal ties. The government was small, weak, and corrupt. When Dawood came to power in 1953, government spending made up only 4% of GDP, and just over a third of that went to defense. With so little investment in defense, the state couldn't even protect itself. Dawood wanted to change that. He was determined to modernize Afghanistan, centralize power, and position the country favorably in the Cold War. To do so, he needed massive foreign aid.
I came back with many impressions of Afghanistan, a land of superb and rugged beauty. But the major impression that I had was with regard to the spirit of your people, a spirit which through the centuries has meant that Afghanistan has been unconquered and unconquerable.
In 1954, Dawood turned to the United States, but Washington didn't view Afghanistan as strategically important and ignored his request for aid. He then turned to the Soviets, who provided military and economic aid and quickly became central to Afghanistan's economy and administration. Dawood also advocated for a renegotiation of the Durand Line. You see, ever since the partition of India in 1947, the dispute had resurfaced. When the British gave Indians the choice to join either India or Pakistan, the Afghans argued that the millions of Pashtuns in the northwest frontier province should be given the option to either become independent or join Afghanistan. London ignored the proposal completely, and it soon became a hopeless cause. Now, with Dawood in power, he decided to try again. In 1960, he sent troops across the Durand Line, hoping to reunite with the Pashtuns in Pakistan, but was defeated by the local Pashtuns. The locals were like, yes, you are Pashtuns, we are Pashtuns, but that doesn't mean you can just show up and start acting like you own the place. In 1961, Dawood tried again with a larger army only to be crushed by the Pakistani Air Force. As a result of the hostility, Afghanistan-Pakistan relations hit an all-time low. In 1961, the two countries severed diplomatic ties and bilateral trade came to a halt. The closure of the border destroyed the Afghan economy, leading to greater dependence on the USSR. The Afghans were outraged. Seeing Dawood's position grew shaky, his cousin King Zahir forced him to resign in March 1963, reclaiming power after being sidelined for over 30 years. Once in power, the king quickly improved relations with Pakistan. 2 months after Dawood's resignation, Afghanistan and Pakistan reached an agreement and reopened the border. In 1964, the king drafted a new constitution, transforming Afghanistan into a constitutional monarchy with a democratic system of government. The constitution also banned members of the royal family from holding senior government positions, effectively blocking Dawood's return to power. However, the democratization of Afghanistan ultimately failed. King Zahir proved to be an indecisive leader, far too concerned about the limits that democratic reforms might place on his authority. He messed up both the legislature and the cabinet. Meanwhile, Dawood refused to step aside and set out to frustrate the reform in whatever way he could, and used every means available, including the pro-Soviet People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA. The course of Afghan history was about to change. The PDPA was founded in Kabul in 1965, but split into two factions, Parcham and Halak, in 1967 due to ideological differences. Halak, led by Turki, pushed for immediate and radical socialist reforms. Parcham, led by Karamallah, was more moderate. Both factions maintained contact with the USSR, but their division kept the PDPA's influence limited. That changed in 1973. That year, while King Zahir was on a trip to Italy, Dawood, with the help of Parcham, overthrew the monarchy, declared the Republic of Afghanistan, and became its first president. Initially, Dawood hailed Afghanistan's close ties with the Soviet Union and identified Pakistan as the only neighbor with which Afghanistan had serious tensions. But after consolidating power in 1975, he began purging communists, downplayed the dispute with Pakistan, and saw closer relations with anti-Soviet countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. Dawood then went to the US again for aid, but the Americans, still mired in Vietnam, ignored him once more. The purge of communists and anti-Soviet policy eventually backfired. Brezhnev had already criticized Dawood during the 1977 meeting in Moscow, to which Dawood responded angrily. "We will never allow you to dictate to us how to run our country and whom to employ in Afghanistan. How and where we employ the foreign experts will remain the exclusive prerogative of the Afghan state. Afghanistan shall remain poor if necessary, but free in its acts and decisions." The Soviets were furious and helped reconcile the Parcham and Khalaq factions. In March 1977, the PDPA was reunited. Daoud tried desperately to crush it, but it was already too late. On April 27, 1978, the PDPA carried out a coup and killed Daoud along with most of his family.
Our relationship, you all should be attentively here. Our relationship with all the countries, including Soviet Union, and all our neighbors and throughout the world will be based and depend on the amount of their support to our revolutionary government in political, economical field.
Does this mean, Mr. President, that you will be following the strict policy of non-alignment?
This is quite correct.
Soon after, the PDPA declared Afghanistan a democratic republic with unshakable fraternal ties with the Soviet Union. In return, Moscow poured in hundreds of advisors and millions of dollars in military and economic aid to help the PDPA consolidate power. However, the PDPA had zero legitimacy among the people and knew nothing about running a country. Their rapid reforms and godless ideology angered the Afghans. A massive uprising broke out in Herat in March 1979, followed by mutinies in the army and across the country. Islamic militant groups emerged, backed by both Pakistan and the United States. Meanwhile, the old rivalry between Parcham and Khalaq resurfaced. The party soon tore itself to pieces. Khalaq defeated Parcham and exiled Karamallah. But even within Khalaq, divisions remained. In the end, Turkey was killed by his former protege, Amin, who emerged as the new leader. By late 1979, the Soviet Union was faced with two choices: either to let the PDPA regime collapse in favor of a militia-led Islamic government south of its border, or to intervene to save PDPA rule. It chose the latter, an option that would drag it to hell. Facing a nationwide uprising, the PDPA turned to the Soviet Union for help. At first, the Soviets were reluctant to get involved. They had not engineered a revolution, but were glad to have a friendly regime in Afghanistan. Whether this friendliness was worth military intervention, which would surely inflame the relations with the United States and damage the détente that had emerged between the two superpowers, was another matter. But over the course of 1979, Soviet opinion shifted. Amin was becoming increasingly erratic, and the Soviets feared that he might cut a deal with the Americans and turn against them. On December 10, 1979, the Politburo made the fateful decision to intervene in Afghanistan. 2 weeks later, Soviet special forces stormed the Tajbek Palace in Kabul, killed Amin, and installed the Parcham leader Karamallah in power.
So the first question is, Mr. Karmal, how long, to your mind, Soviet military aid may continue?
As I have made it absolutely clear on many occasions, the limited contingent of the Soviet armed forces came to Afghanistan on the request of the Revolutionary Council and the government of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan in accordance with the Treaty of Friendship and all-sided cooperation, as well as in accordance with the United Nations Charter. The Soviet military contingent presence in Afghanistan is of temporary nature. They will leave our country as soon as the cause for their invitation no longer exists.
Initially, the Soviets hoped for a short mission to restore order while Afghan forces put down the rebellion. But with American and Pakistani support flooding in, resistance proved unbreakable. Soviet soldiers soon found themselves in a full-scale war, one that would drag on for a decade. For the United States, the Soviet invasion, coming on the heels of Iran's revolution, threatened its position in the Middle East and access to oil. The Arab world, led by Saudi Arabia, felt directly threatened by both the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet advance, as did Pakistan, which had long had uneasy relations with Afghanistan. The three came together to back the Afghan resistance. Many Muslim volunteers also joined the fight. Among them was a wealthy 22-year-old Saudi who poured much of his own fortune into the war effort. His time in Afghanistan and Pakistan would not only reshape his worldview, but also alter U.S. Middle East policy for decades to come, and ultimately the skyline of New York City. His name was Osama bin Laden. The resistance fighters, known as the Mujahideen, were celebrated in the West as freedom fighters. Ronald Reagan even welcomed their leaders to the White House, comparing them with the founding fathers of the United States.
The support that the United States has been providing the resistance will be strengthened rather than diminished so that it can continue to fight effectively for freedom. The just struggle against foreign tyranny can count upon worldwide support, both political and material. The goal of the United States remains a genuinely independent Afghanistan, free from external interference, an Afghanistan whose people choose the type of government they wish, an Afghanistan to which the 4 million refugees from Soviet aggression may return in safety and, yes, in honor.
Throughout the Cold War, the West had seen Islam as an antidote to communism and a useful ally to be supported and nurtured. Do you see the hypocrisy here? When Nazism is the threat, communism is a useful ally. When communism is the threat, Islam is a useful ally. When Islam is the threat, Judaism is a useful ally. And when Judaism is the threat, does that mean we're going back to Nazism and repeating the whole cycle one more time? This is nuts. To the politicians, it's all temporary, all fakery, and all propaganda. As for the people, we are told to hate each other, and most of the time, to kill each other. It's just war after war after war. Anyway, there was also the assumption that Soviet Muslims could serve as a fifth column. To stir Islamic fervor in Central Asia, the CIA translated the Quran into Uzbek and smuggled it, along with works by radical Islamic writers, into Soviet territory. But, to their disappointment, Central Asian Muslims remained loyal to the USSR with no defections or desertions. Yet, this effort to radicalize Islam did give birth to something that continues to haunt the world. Before you ask, yes, modern jihadism was a child of the Cold War, born in the trenches of Afghanistan and the refugee camps of Pakistan. And, believe it or not, the United States of America played a direct and undeniable role in its creation. Back in Moscow, Brezhnev wasn't doing well. Since 1973, his central nervous system had been deteriorating. His unhappy family life took a heavy toll on his mental health. By early 1982, even speaking and moving had become a challenge. That March, during a factory visit in Tashkent, a railing collapsed on him, striking his head and fracturing a collarbone. On November 7, 1982, Brezhnev made his final public appearance at the 65th anniversary of the October Revolution. 3 days later, he died of a heart attack at age 75. 2 days after his death, KGB chairman Yuri Andropov was elected general secretary. Andropov was terminally ill when he came to power and spent most of his 15-month rule in the hospital. By January 1984, he fell into a coma and died a few days later on February 9th, aged 69. Andropov was succeeded by his chief deputy, Konstantin Chernenko, who was also terminally ill and spent much of his time hospitalized. On March 10, 1985, Chernenko fell into a coma and died at age 73 after just 13 months in office. In less than 3 years, 3 supreme leaders of the Soviet Union had died in office. The next day, all newspapers in the USSR announced Chernenko's death on page 2, printing his obituary. Page 1 featured a large photo and biography of the new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, the man who would become the last leader of the Soviet Union. Despite the rapid turnover in leadership, Andropov, Chernenko, and Gorbachev shared a common goal: restructuring the Soviet system and reducing corruption. You see, a country's bureaucracy is like a complex machine with many interconnected parts. Sometimes parts break, vanish, or just don't quite fit. To keep it running smoothly, a little lubricant is often needed, and in many cases, that lubricant is corruption. Harmful and unethical, yes, but in practice, it can make the gears turn a bit more easily. Under Brezhnev, corruption was practically baked into the system. I mean, when your slogan is trust in cadres, you kind of have to turn a blind eye to certain things. For a time, it worked, but by the late Brezhnev years, the cracks were starting to show. Economic stagnation, inefficiency, and public cynicism became impossible to ignore. To reverse the trend and save the nation, Andropov launched an anti-corruption campaign. In his brave 15-month tenure, Andropov dismissed 18 ministers and 37 first secretaries of Soviet republics and initiated criminal cases against high-level party and state officials. Uzbekistan was among the first to feel the heat. In August 1983, First Secretary Shalov Lashidov was hit with a mountain of letters sent to the Central Committee, all accusing the republic of widespread corruption and lawlessness. Under Brezhnev, such letters were usually returned to Tashkent and ignored. But under Andropov, the party took a different approach. This time they confronted Lashidov head-on and sent teams of investigators to Uzbekistan. What they uncovered shocked everyone. Beyond the usual nepotism, bribery, and embezzlement, investigators found that cotton production figures had been systematically falsified for years. Between 1978 and 1983, Uzbekistan had overreported its output by 4.5 million tons, almost an entire year's worth of quotas. By February 1986, 40 of the 65 province-level secretaries and more than 260 local party secretaries had been removed. One-third of all district and city administration chairmen faced criminal charges. Hundreds of criminal cases were opened, thousands were imprisoned, several officials were sentenced to death, and some disgraced cadres even committed suicide. The first secretary of Uzbekistan, Shalov Lashidov himself, died during the investigation. All of this played out on the front pages of national newspapers and on central television. Russian policymakers and academics began to argue that Central Asia was a burden on the state, and that the subsidies paid to the region were impoverishing Russia. Uzbeks were furious about the purge, furious about the investigators, furious at the constant criticism of the republic, and furious about the influx of European cadres. The cotton scandal had grown into more than a corruption case. It was now a national humiliation. When Gorbachev took office in 1985, economic growth had slowed over the past 15 years. Global competition with the United States was draining resources. Environmental problems were becoming harder to ignore, and the administration was quite literally falling apart. But instead of stabilizing the already crumbling Soviet order, Gorbachev shattered it completely. Throughout 1985, Gorbachev forced the first secretaries of the Communist parties of Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan to retire, leaving Kunayev of Kazakhstan as the only Brezhnev-era leader still in power. A year later, in December 1986, even Kunayev was removed from office. By 1988, the newly appointed first secretary of the Communist Party of Uzbekistan was also forced out of office. Gorbachev was aware that the challenges required new answers, but his answers unleashed forces that he could not control. Ускорение, acceleration, glasnost, openness, перестройка, restructuring, новополитическое мышление, new political thinking, and демократизация, democratization. To the USSR, these were all destructive forces, and glasnost, openness, was undoubtedly the most destructive. The fateful campaign made it possible to express ideas and attitudes that were once taboo. Overnight, intellectuals, writers, poets, and filmmakers found their voices. Soon, the entire Soviet economic program was up for debate. The blank spots in recent history were filled. Interest in Islam soared. Anti-nuclear protests started, and hundreds of organizations were born. Cossack organizations appeared in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan demanding political rights. In northern Kazakhstan, some Russian organizations demanded to accede to Russia. In Samarkand, ethnic Tajiks began fighting discrimination and calling for greater rights in Uzbekistan. In Jalalabad and Osh, ethnic Uzbeks began building cultural centers and calling for greater rights in Kyrgyzstan. Soon, communal violence erupted. In June 1989, Uzbeks clashed with the Meskhetian Turks in the Fergana Valley, leaving around 100 dead. A year later, Uzbeks and Kyrgyz fought near Osh, killing 300 to 600 people. In February 1990, violence broke out in Dushanbe, where Tajiks attacked all Europeans in the city. The unity that once held people together began to crumble. While all of this were happening, that war in Afghanistan was still going on. In early 1986, Gorbachev pointed out that the Soviet Union was entangled in a costly and unwinnable war. Later that year, the Politburo finally decided to end the war. By February 1989, the Soviet forces had withdrawn from Afghanistan. The decade-long occupation had claimed 13,000 Soviet lives, left 50,000 injured, and cost 60 billion rubles. For much of its history, Soviet federalism was more a legal fiction than a true political reality. According to the constitution, the 15 Union republics were sovereign entities that had voluntarily joined the Soviet Federation. But with Gorbachev's reforms, the republics began to act more like actual political entities. They sought not only to claim the rights promised by the constitution, but also to expand them unilaterally. In November 1988, the Estonian Supreme Soviet issued a declaration affirming the sovereignty guaranteed in the Soviet constitution. Other republics followed suit, and by 1990, a parade of sovereignties was in full swing. Even Russia itself declared its sovereignty from the Soviet Union. The tide hit Central Asia that summer. Uzbekistan declared its sovereignty on June 20, 1990. Turkmenistan and Tajikistan followed in August, Kazakhstan in October, and Kyrgyzstan in December. The dissolution of the Soviet Union, once unimaginable, began to seem inevitable. Nonetheless, nobody in Central Asia wanted complete independence. Central Asia occupied the worst position in the Soviet Union. Economically, it was a supplier of raw materials, and geographically, it was completely landlocked and far from Europe. It simply couldn't afford to be severed from the USSR. Yet, despite this reality, Central Asia had very little say in the matter. Gorbachev tried to reconstitute the Soviet Union based on a new Union Treaty. In March 1991, he put the proposal to a union-wide referendum. There was plenty of opposition, and 6 of the 15 republics refused to participate. But the 5 Central Asian republics voted overwhelmingly to preserve the Union. Far from posing an Islamic threat to the Soviet Union, Central Asians had turned out to be the most Soviet of all Soviet citizens. In the hopes of restoring order, some hardliners in the Politburo launched a coup on August 19th. Tanks rolled into Moscow, and troops attempted to storm the Russian government offices. However, the tanks were quickly surrounded by protesters. Boris Yeltsin, the newly elected president of Russia, climbed atop one of them and gave a speech.
Они дискредитируют Союз перед всем миром, подрывая наш престиж в мировом сообществе, возвращают нас к эпохе холодной войны и изоляции Советского Союза от мирового сообщества. Все это заставляет нас объявить незаконным пришедший к власти так называемый комитет.
Once the coup failed, all Central Asian presidents declared the republics independent. Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan declared independence on August 31st, Tajikistan on September 9th, and Turkmenistan at the end of October. Kazakhstan waited until December and was the last one to leave the Union. On December 8th, at the Belarusian government Dhaka in a forest near the Polish border, the presidents of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, the 3 remaining signatories of the original 1922 Soviet Union Treaty, officially dissolved the Union. A few days later, on Christmas Day 1991, Gorbachev resigned.
Я покидаю свой пост с тревогой, но и с надеждой, с верой в вас, вашу мудрость и силу духа. Мы наследники великой цивилизации, и сейчас от всех и каждого зависит, чтобы она возродилась к новой, современной и достойной жизни.
And the very next day, The once mighty Soviet Union disappeared into thin air. The dissolution of the Soviet state triggered an economic crisis. Exchange systems collapsed, goods were scarce, and salaries went unpaid. The ruble plunged into inflation, and people struggled to find basic necessities. There was a sense of demodernization, of things going backward. Boundaries between the republics hardened into international borders, families were divided, and local commercial networks were disrupted. In Soviet times, roads and railways often crossed republican boundaries. The easiest way to travel from Kujang to Dushanbe was via Samarkand in Uzbekistan. The road from Samarkand to Tashkent passed through Kazakhstan, while roads in the Fergana Valley crisscrossed republic borders. Even today, unresolved enclaves still remain in the Fergana Valley. Uzbekistan has built new routes that avoid crossing international borders, while Tajikistan has built a tunnel connecting Dushanbe to Kujang. I was actually in that tunnel on my way to Dushanbe. It was pitch dark, full of potholes. Not exactly my best tunnel experience. Uzbeks in Kyrgyzstan, Tajiks in Uzbekistan, and Russians throughout Central Asia became minorities. Realizing life would be different in a Central Asia no longer tied to Russia, most Russians left. The one exception is Kazakhstan, where Russians still account for nearly a quarter of the population. Following the Russians, nearly all of Central Asia's 45,000 Jews and 700,000 Germans also immigrated. New governments began a process of de-Sovietization and de-Russification, creating a narrative that cast Russia as a long-term oppressor. They passed laws making national languages the state languages and questioned the use of the Cyrillic script. Turkmenistan switched to the Latin alphabet in 1993, followed by Uzbekistan the same year. Kazakhstan announced the shift in 2017. The history of the 20th century was re-evaluated. Those killed in the Great Purge became national heroes. Literature from the 1920s, once banned, is now widely available in modern editions. Cities and streets were renamed and respelled in national languages. Leningrad reverted to Kujang, Frunze to Bishkek, Ashgabat to Ashgabat, and Alma-Ata to Almaty. In Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, communist leaders effortlessly transformed themselves into national leaders. Nursultan Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan was the only candidate in the presidential election of December 1991, winning a Soviet-style 98.7% of the vote. Saparmurat Niyazov of Turkmenistan outdid him with 99.5% in June 1992. Islam Karimov of Uzbekistan won 87.5% of the vote in December 1991. All three managed to get re-elected several times. Niyazov and Karimov died in office, while Nazarbayev resigned in 2019 after almost 30 years in office. The transition was trickier in Kyrgyzstan, where divisions in party leadership led to the election of an outsider, Askar Akayev, as a compromise candidate in 1990. Akayev stayed in power until massive protests forced him to flee in 2005. Since then, the country has seen several changes of leadership, but its political elites still have links to the late Soviet period. Tajikistan, however, ran into a bit of trouble and descended into a full-blown civil war. I actually went to all the major cities involved, Kujang, Dushanbe, Khorugin-Tepa, Kulob, etc., and filmed them. But there were just so many details about this war that I simply couldn't fit them in here. I think I will make a separate video just on this topic in the future. For now, all you need to know is that the war was fought mainly between Tajiks from the Communist Party and Tajiks from the Islamic Renaissance Party, along with several separatist groups from the Pamirs. It went on for 5 years, claiming between 50,000 and 120,000 lives, and devastated the nation's economy and infrastructure. So many Tajiks fled to Afghanistan that today there are more Tajiks in Afghanistan than in Tajikistan. The Pamirs were severely depopulated. If not for the aid from Aga Khan IV, the Pamirs might have been wiped out entirely. I mean, even today, you still need a special permit to enter the Pamirs, and must register your passport with the military every 100 kilometers or so. The war ended in an armistice, and Emomali Rahmon, the communist leader of Kulob, rose to power and has ruled ever since. Uzbekistan also faced pressure from the Islamic Revolution. In December 1991, just before Karimov's election as president, a group called Adalet in Namagan demanded a meeting with him. Adolf wanted the building housing the city committee of the Communist Party to be turned into an Islamic center, Islamic parties legalized, and most importantly, Uzbekistan declared an Islamic state. Karimov managed to talk his way out of the meeting, but he was alarmed. Eventually, Karimov drove Adolf out of the country and launched a campaign against religious extremism. Many Adolf members ended up in Afghanistan, where they became increasingly radical and vowed to overthrow Karimov and establish an Islamic state in Uzbekistan. The group was responsible for several bombings, hostage hijackings, and multiple incursions in the 1990s. The turmoil in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan in the 90s led us to our next topic: Islamic radicalism. You see, the new Central Asia emerged on the global stage just as Islam was replacing communism as the ideological threat to the post-Soviet order. The region's proximity to Afghanistan ensured that the fear of radical Islam defined the region's security agenda. Central Asia's elites were in a difficult position. As Soviet men, they found the idea of religion meddling in politics to be unnatural and were averse to all religious opposition. Yet, Islam is also part of the national heritage and cannot be avoided. The new presidents took their first oath on the Holy Quran, and some of them even performed the Hajj. Therefore, the Central Asian governments must decide which forms of Islam are permitted and which are not. While the great Islamic scholars and Sufis of the past are revered as national heroes, other forms of Islam, especially those that bring influences from other countries, have to be countered. Each country has a religious directorate that manages mosques and has a monopoly over Islamic publishing and education. Islamic activity independent of these administrations is by definition illegal and prosecuted. The lead was taken by Uzbekistan. Defiant ulama were arrested or simply disappeared, their mosques shut down and repurposed. In 1998, arrests and mosque closures became a full-blown campaign when a new law mandated that all religious activity take place in places registered with the state. If you visit mosques in Uzbekistan, you will most certainly find a sign like this at the entrance saying it is state-approved. In Tajikistan, the government turned the ulama into civil servants and required them to wear uniforms and to read sermons that have been pre-approved. All students studying in religious institutions abroad were ordered to return home. Tajikistan also passed a law banning religious education at home and banning minors from attending mosques or participating in any religious activities except for funerals. The other three states in Central Asia have similar policies and maintain the same distance from Islam. Meanwhile, Afghanistan saw new development. With the Soviet withdrawal, the US felt that it had achieved its goals and wound down its Afghan involvement. When the PDPA government collapsed in April 1992, the United States left the country's fate to be decided by warring mujahideen groups and their patrons, primarily Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Amid the chaos, one Pakistan-backed militia group rose to power, the Taliban. When the Taliban captured Kabul in 1996, Osama bin Laden turned 39 years old. That year, he moved to Afghanistan and began building a new base for his organization, Al-Qaeda. Although the two groups had very different objectives, the Taliban was trying to create a puritanical Islamic state at home through guerrilla warfare, while Al-Qaeda was trying to launch a global jihad against the West and Israel through terrorism. The two groups collaborated closely. The Taliban allowed Al-Qaeda to settle in Afghanistan in exchange for financial and military support. Al-Qaeda fighters were trained in Taliban camps, and bin Laden pledged loyalty to Taliban leader Mullah Omar. By 2000, the Taliban had solidified its grip on Afghanistan. It disarmed the population, restored order, opened the roads to traffic, and dropped food prices. These measures were well received by the population. At the same time, Sharia law was imposed. Female seclusion was reinstated, and anything that even remotely resembled a human statue was ordered to be destroyed. The two Buddhas in Bamiyan, over 1400 years old, had reached their final moments. In March 2001, they were blasted to pieces by dynamite, artillery, and tank shells, returning to dust and rubble. The destruction of the Buddhas made global headlines and was widely condemned. However, Little did the Taliban knew that just 6 months later, their good friends in Al-Qaeda would unleash something so catastrophic, so utterly devastating, that it would make blowing up those Buddhas look like a schoolboy prank. Tuesday, September 11th, 2001. The skies over the eastern United States were clear, the kind of deep September blue that settles in just before the fall. In Boston, Newark, and Washington, D.C., 19 men boarded 4 commercial flights bound for California. They carried box cutters, pepper spray, and the quiet, terrifying conviction of martyrdom. At 7:59 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 took off from Logan International Airport in Boston. 15 minutes into the flight, 5 hijackers took control of the plane. At 8:14 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 took off from Logan as well. 28 minutes into the flight, 5 hijackers took control of the plane. At 8:20 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 departed from Dulles International Airport. 31 minutes into the flight, 5 hijackers took control of the plane. At 8:42 a.m., the last of the 4 planes, United Airlines Flight 93, departed Newark International Airport. 46 minutes into the flight, 4 hijackers took control of the plane. Then it began. At 8:46 a.m., Flight 11 crashed into the World Trade Center's North Tower between the 93rd and 99th floors. The explosion roared through the building. Glass, steel, and paper rained down. 17 minutes after the first plane struck the North Tower, Flight 175 crashed into the South Tower at 9:03 a.m. A fireball erupted, visible for miles. By then, every television in America was on, and millions were watching. America was under attack. At 9:37 a.m., Flight 77 crashed into the west side of the Pentagon. Fire and jet fuel tore through the building. The symbol of American military power was burning. But one plane was still in the sky, Flight 93. By then, the passengers had learned of the attacks in New York and Washington, and they took action. Roughly 30 minutes after the hijacking, at 9:57 a.m., the brave passengers fought their way to the front of the cabin and began breaking down the cockpit door. Fearing their captives would regain control, the hijackers rolled the plane and sent it to a nosedive, crashing into a field southeast of Pittsburgh at 10:03 a.m. The plane was about 20 minutes from D.C., and its target is believed to have been either the U.S. Capitol or the White House. By 10:28 a.m., both towers in the World Trade Center had collapsed. In less than 2 hours, 2,977 lives were lost, and the United States had suffered the worst terrorist attacks in history. To get to China from Tajikistan, one must go through the Pamirs. And there's only one way in, one way out, and that, my friends, is the Pamir Highway. Now, calling it a highway is a bit generous. The Pamir Highway is less of a road and more of a suggestion. It's rough, it's high, it's bumpy, and at certain points it feels like the planet is actively trying to throw your off it. Comfort, forget it. Suspension, gone. Sanity, hanging on by a thread. But believe it or not, that's not even the hardest part. No, the hardest part is actually finding a car that takes you there. In Tajikistan, going from point A to point B is like solving a 4-part riddle. You need the right car, the right price, the right people, and the right time. Miss one and you're back to square one drinking tea with a bunch of dedushkas. And let me tell you, it took me 2 solid hours of negotiation, guesswork, and mild despair to get all 4 to line up. But eventually, I squeezed myself into a car that promised to take me to my first stop in the Pamirs, Kalaihoun.
Finally found a car to go to Kalaihoun. This is my new friend from Globe, and this is his little cousin, and that's the grandpa. We're taking this car to California. It's gonna be very exciting. Okay, so хорошо. Alright, so that's the border check. If you wanna enter the premieres, you have to apply for a special permit and all that. Afghanistan. So in Kalakum, I stayed in the same hostel both bankrupt stayed while he was here. And I happened to stay in the same room both bankrupt stayed. We slept in the same bed. You can see a lot of people are promoting their channels here in the hostel. Maybe I should do that too. I quite like Kalakum. It's a peaceful little village. There's only 1,000 residents, little over 1,000 residents, and the people are quite nice too. And there's just a quite unique way to express their love for Tajikistan. I heartbreak Tajikistan. I mean, the people in this region were involved in the Tajik civil war, and yeah, I think they have some mixed feelings about Tajikistan. Behold, viewers, that is the land of Afghanistan. I'm currently in a small town in central Tajikistan called Kalakum by the Afghan border. The headwater of Amudarya, the Panj River, runs through here, and then on the other side of the river is the Taliban country, Afghanistan. I was actually planning to go there on this trip, but honestly, I am reaching my breaking point. So exhausted from filming, moving, talking, and everything. The day before yesterday, I actually collapsed while filming and couldn't get up. Plus, there was news about foreign tourists getting shot in Afghanistan just 2 or 3 weeks ago, so yeah, I decided to skip it this time, and this is the best I can do. The plan was to get some great shots from here and casually bring up the extremely controversial topic of the Taliban. So, following the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989, the country descended into civil war among various Mujahideen factions, leading to a power vacuum and societal chaos. And in September 1994, one prominent faction from the Afghan Civil War, largely consisting of the students from eastern and southern Afghanistan who had been educated in traditional Islamic schools, rose to power. This faction is known as the Taliban, which literally means students, and they promised stability and the return of order. Under the leadership of Mullah Omar, the movement expanded across most of Afghanistan, shifting power away from the Mujahideen warlords. By 1996, they controlled approximately 3/4 of the country and established the first Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Then, on September 11th, 2001, the 9/11 happened. And 3 months later, the United States invaded Afghanistan. As a result, the Taliban was overthrown.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime.
Despite being under-equipped in every way imaginable, the Taliban never gave up. And the war lasted 19 years and 10 months, making it the longest war ever fought by the United States. And in May 2021, a little over 3 years ago, the Taliban launched a military offensive and miraculously regained the control of Afghanistan.
I'm speaking to you today from the Roosevelt, the Treaty Room in the White House, the same spot where on October of 2001, President George W. Bush informed our nation that the United States military had begun strikes on terrorist training camps in Afghanistan. I'm now the fourth United States president to preside over American troop presence in Afghanistan. 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. I will not pass this responsibility onto a 5th. I've concluded that it's time to end America's longest war. It's time for American troops to come home.
The Taliban's recapture of Afghanistan and the U.S. retreat is a story unlike anything else. Looking at this reality, the obvious question arises. How did the richest and the most powerful country on earth lose to these ill-equipped, backward soldiers from one of the poorest countries on earth? I mean, the result was so counterintuitive that many people, even now, find it hard to believe. And sitting on the edge of Tajikistan, like literally, this is the edge of Tajikistan, and gazing into Afghanistan, I'd like to attempt to answer this question. How did the Taliban achieve that? I think there are 3 factors that we need to consider. And the first one is right in front of us, Afghanistan's mountainous terrain. The Hindu Kush mountain range is the most prominent geographical feature of Afghanistan. This formidable mountain chain runs from northeast to southwest and divides the country into 3 distinct regions: the Central Highlands, the Northern Plains, and the Southwestern Plateau. This terrain makes it extremely difficult to wage war conventionally. It's challenging for logistics. It's difficult to get air support and even difficult to walk around. This favors guerrilla tactics and insurgency, which the Afghans have a long history of employing. The second factor has something to do with the Afghan people's national identity. You see, the Afghans possess a fierce sense of national pride and independence, which makes them incredibly difficult to control and occupy for extended periods. For hundreds of years, since the time of the Great Game, Afghanistan has been the home to all sorts of anti-colonial fighters, the Basmachis, the Mujahideens, and many, many other groups. Perhaps as a result of all these elements in the gene pool, Afghanistan is thought to breed the toughest, hardest to subdue people anywhere. The desire for independence and the desire to kick the outsiders out has always been the strongest among all the stand countries, which explains why so many powerful countries tried to take Afghanistan and failed. Assalamu alaikum. Salam. The third factor to consider is Pakistan. You see, ever since the Afghan-Soviet War, Pakistan has played a complex role in Afghanistan. Pakistan provided training camps and safe havens within its borders for Afghan fighters, and also played a logistic role in supplying and equipping the fighters. The Basmachi, Mujahideen, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the Taliban are all closely connected to Pakistan. In fact, the former leader of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, was killed not in his home country in Saudi Arabia or his headquarters, in Afghanistan, but in Pakistan. With the support of Pakistan, the Taliban fighters always have a place to retreat to and plan their next steps. Because of these three factors, the geography, the national identity, and the support from Pakistan, the Taliban was able to defeat the United States and regain control of Afghanistan. You know, come to think of it, this war that took the United States and NATO nearly 2 decades to fight was nothing but a tragedy. Thousands of Afghan civilians and military personnel were killed, along with thousands of US and allied troops. The United States alone spent over $2 trillion on the war effort and virtually achieved nothing. The United States aimed to transform Afghanistan into a stable, democratic nation. However, these efforts obviously backfired. As for the initial reason for American presence here, 9/11, well, terrorism remains a significant threat. You know, standing here, I can actually see a lot of things happening. You can see a bunch of Afghan ladies cleaning their carpets across the river. Some kids, I think, swimming. And they're slapping each other with the carpet or whatever, maybe their towel, you know, just horsing around. And there are a bunch of people chasing their animals into the mountain, I think. I think there are 2 Taliban soldiers right there. I don't know. Maybe. Yesterday, you know what's so crazy? Yesterday I saw a helicopter taking off right in front of my eyes. It's huge. Fascinating thing, yeah. And they're trying to send some supplies to this region. I have no idea.
After the dust of the 1990s and 2000s settled, the 5 Central Asian states took different paths. The 2 resource-rich countries, Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, saw one grow increasingly reclusive, while the other opened up to the world. The resource-poor Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan endured post-Soviet turmoil and remained poor. A growing population and a lack of economic activity led to massive labor migration. As much as 10% of Tajikistan's population, 20% of Kyrgyzstan's population, and 5 to 8% of Uzbekistan's population work abroad, mostly in Russia or Kazakhstan, with remittances making up a huge portion of their GDPs. Ironically, while the Soviet Union existed, officials could hardly get Central Asians to move to cities. Now, with the Soviet welfare state gone, the economic difficulties compelled them to leave their homes. To the disappointment of the Western hawks, after the demise of the Soviet Union, Central Asia did not embrace liberalism. All but Kyrgyzstan developed personal cults around their leaders. In Uzbekistan, Islam Karimov ruled from 1990 until his death in 2016. His works were published and became required reading for school children. All scholarly work in the humanities and social sciences had to use his wisdom to justify its significance. In Tajikistan, Emomali Rahmon declared himself leader of the nation and president for life. If you visit Tajikistan, it's nearly impossible to avoid seeing his portrait at least 30 times a day. In Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev held power for 30 years. His special status as leader of the nation was enshrined in law. Numerous institutions bear his name, and even the capital, Astana, was renamed Nursultan from 2019 to 2022 in his honor. However, the cult in Turkmenistan is on another level. Sapar Murad Niyazov led the country from 1985 until his death in 2006. Parliament bestowed upon him the title of Turkmenbashi, head of Turkmen, and named him president for life.
Bak serdarım adaletın kanatıdır.
Ulu ehmiyetinin bolcak sonra bir önen yargı beyit serdarımız. Sizin alp var yani. İyiliyurt bekbeytli. İçeri vadaşları. İnsan terör siyasetlerini biz ruhavati yaşları doli makbullayar.
In 2001, Niyazov published the Ruhnama, Book of the Spirit, claiming to have written it with the help of inspiration sent to my heart by the God who created this wonderful universe. Quickly, the book became part of the school curriculum. Government employees were required to study it, and those who seeking driver's license were tested on it. He was succeeded by Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov, who proclaimed himself Orthodox, the protector, and built a new cult around himself. The protector was seen on television playing the guitar, rapping, and even DJing. Gurbanguly stepped down in 2022 and was succeeded by his son, Serdar. Turkmenistan is now the first country in Central Asia to be ruled by a dynastic system. As the Soviet Union collapsed, the resource allocation structures remained intact. Across Central Asia, governments continued to control natural resources and hold major stakes in key industries. As a result, no social forces exist independently of the state, and corruption is rampant. Presidents sit at the top of patronage networks, granting access to resources and revenue. With the system tightly controlled by one party and one president, it's clear why building a cult of personality around the leader is essential and why political opposition is ruthlessly crushed. The opposition group in Kazakhstan was either banned or murdered. The opposition group in Uzbekistan, Adalat, aka the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, was ousted from the country and fled to Afghanistan. And the opposition group in Tajikistan, the Islamic Renaissance Party, has been marginalized over the years, and in 2015, Emomali Rahmon declared the party a terrorist organization and banned it. Its members also fled to Afghanistan. All five stans in Central Asia have kept the West at arm's length while maintaining close ties with Russia. Trade with Russia remains substantial, and Russian is still the main international language spoken in the region. In 1992, Turkey hosted a summit of all Turkic-speaking states in Ankara, which in 2009 was formalized as the Cooperation Council of the Turkic-speaking states. Its goal is to foster cooperation among the Turkic nations. Turkey also sponsors many Central Asian students to study there. Both Kazakh viewers Ahmadi and Almaty had studied abroad in Turkey. Iran has focused on trade and national security, particularly along its long border with Turkmenistan and its strengthening ties with Tajikistan. Meanwhile, Arab countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar are pouring funds into building hundreds of mosques, reviving the region's Islamic heritage. However, China's influence in the region is on another level. It has become Kazakhstan's second largest trading partner, and Astana was where China announced the Belt and Road Initiative to the world in 2013. In 2009, a Chinese-funded pipeline connected Turkmenistan to Xinjiang, making China the largest importer of Turkmen gas. Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan are all key members of the Belt and Road Initiative and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. China is investing heavily in these countries, building new infrastructure and renovating old ones. Lots of historical sites in Khiva, Bukhara, and Kulob were actually restored with Chinese money. And China is currently rebuilding the Pamir Highway in Tajikistan. Chinese EVs are everywhere in Central Asia, with more arriving each day. During my journey, I even met groups of students speaking excellent Chinese. As for the two stands in South Asia, China was among the few countries that reopened its embassy in Afghanistan and engaged in limited economic cooperation with the Taliban. Meanwhile, Pakistan's ties with China grew stronger. In the 2010s, the two countries launched the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, aiming to shorten China's energy supply route from the Middle East, bypassing the vulnerable Strait of Malacca, and alleviate energy shortages while upgrading infrastructure in Pakistan. Kazakhstan is the largest and most prosperous country in Central Asia. Its vast oil and natural gas reserves provide the basis for its economic growth. Nazarbayev gave up the nuclear weapons at the dawn of independence, moved the capital closer to Russia, and initiated a program to repatriate Kazakhs. Over the years, more than 1 million Kazakhs have returned to Kazakhstan. Most of them came from Uzbekistan and other former Soviet republics. But in recent years, even Kazakhs in Mongolia and China are returning. This has transformed Kazakhstan's demographics, giving the Kazakhs a comfortable majority in the population. Nazarbayev resigned on March 19, 2019, and was succeeded by the Senate Chairman Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. Both leaders are shrewd, authoritarian, and, at the same time, very, very able. Karimov of Uzbekistan was a harsh ruler and was merciless when facing unrest and opposition. He used the National Security Service to maintain order, which monitored domestic and international security. His authoritarian rule led to frequent clashes with the UN and the US, which accused him of human rights violations. He was succeeded by Prime Minister Shavkat Mirziyoyev, who has eased censorship and the surveillance of civil society and allowed greater visibility of Islam. Cotton retains its central place in the economy. Although the government has made some effort to reduce the monoculture, the crop remains a major export earner. In recent years, tourism along the Silk Road has boomed and is likely to reshape the country's economy. Turkmenistan became a reclusive state after independence. In 1991, there was talk of the country transforming into a resource-rich autocracy, offering first-world comforts to all its citizens. But that never happened. Today, Turkmenistan is one of the most controlling and repressive states on Earth. By adopting a permanent neutrality policy, the regime keeps external pressures at bay. China, Russia, and Ukraine remain its main customers, but the dream of connecting to South Asian markets via the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline (TAPI) remains unfulfilled due to Afghanistan's instability and poor relations between Pakistan and India. Kyrgyzstan's experience has been quite the opposite. The 1990s saw a profound economic crisis. One of the country's key sectors, sheep farming, collapsed. The national livestock population went from 12 million in the late 1980s to less than 3 million in 2008. Two presidents were overthrown by popular revolts, and in 2010 the country experienced a terrible ethnic strife, displacing hundreds of thousands of Uzbeks and Kyrgyz. Lacking natural resources, the country's leadership opened it to the world upon independence. The economy was privatized, press controls eased, and NGOs and advisors were welcomed. Given the spectacular beauty of its mountains and the hopes for its transition to a new liberal democracy, Kyrgyzstan was dubbed the Switzerland of Central Asia. Tajikistan grounds its legitimacy in the ancient Iranian heritage, claiming the longest historical roots in the region. Relations with Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan have been tense since independence. Disputes over resources, national identities, and cities like Bukhara and Samarkand make regional cooperation a distant dream. Iran has invested heavily in promoting the Tajik language and culture, maintains a modest presence in Tajikistan's economy, and serves as a counterbalance to the Turkic influence in Central Asia. However, relations with its other Persian neighbor, Afghanistan, are more complicated due to Afghanistan's instability. Despite this, when I was in Tajikistan, everyone I spoke to considered Afghans as their brothers and sisters. The bond between Tajiks and Afghans is deep and enduring. Afghanistan in the second Taliban era is still struggling. Foreign aid has been suspended, assets frozen, and the economy has not recovered, leaving Afghanistan largely isolated on the global stage. Food shortage and refugee crisis remain serious. In October 2023, the Pakistani government ordered the expulsion of millions of Afghans from Pakistan. Iran also decided to deport Afghan nationals back to Afghanistan. Taliban authorities condemned the deportation of Afghans as an inhuman act, but there is not much they can do about it. How to resettle these returned Afghans, and more importantly, how to rebuild the country, remain the most important issues for the Taliban government. Since 2008, Pakistan has entered its fourth democratic era. Between 2009 and 2011, under the pressure from the United States, Pakistan launched military operations against Taliban forces in the northwest, which quelled the militias there, but terrorist attacks continued elsewhere. In 2011, relations with the United States soured after the Americans killed Osama bin Laden at his home less than a mile from the Pakistan military academy. The United States criticized Pakistan for allegedly harboring bin Laden. As of 2025, conflicts with India over Kashmir and with Afghanistan over the Durand Line remain unresolved, with the threat of war ever present. Alright folks, this is it. This is where I say goodbye. We've reached the end of the journey. You must be tired. I know I am. It's been a very long, very tedious, and very, very challenging journey, hasn't it? But to me, the Seven Stones is one of the most fascinating regions I've ever come across. And I truly hope that one day You can go on a trip there yourself. Go see the mountains, walk along the rivers, watch the sand dunes shift, run freely across the vast pastures, and meet people with a different point of view.
Oh, hi. If you're watching this, congratulations, you have made it to the very end. Not a lot of people get to see this part, so for that, our heartfelt thank you. I am deep in the Pamirs now, near a Kyrgyz village, right over there, in eastern Tajikistan, near the Chinese border. This is one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to, but it is also harsh, rough, full of danger, and extremely inclement. It took me 2 full days to get here. Sorry, I have a little bit of trouble breathing. This is 3,500 meters above the sea level. Breathing could be a bit challenging if you're not used to it. Anyways, I think we live in a time where everything we see and hear can easily be manipulated by big institutions. One tweak in the algorithm, one actual space in the code can literally change how millions of people think or act. You know, sometimes I have this pessimistic thought about how humanity is degenerating and how people are becoming mindless sheep. We eat whatever is put in front of us. We go wherever they want us to go, and we never look up. More and more people are forgetting what having a good meal feels like, what spending 10 years on something feels like, and more importantly, the reality of life. People are quick to jump to conclusions, pick sides, ignore uncomfortable truths. Everything is becoming shorter, brighter, quicker, fancier, and in many ways, shadier. Well, Jingwu show is not and will never be part of that trend. Here, videos are made long, complex, and each one of them has its own unique characters. They will never be picked up by the algorithm because they are destined to be watched by the very few. You guys. As someone who considers himself as a good cook, I want you to think of me as a chef who only cook for the most prestigious clients. I am extremely picky about my ingredients, my cooking, and my fire, so that I can provide my clients with the most mind-blowing experience ever. I want to say it is my honor to serve you. I want to say thank you, good luck, and bon appetit. I will see you in the next one. Cheers. Yeah.